Hi, Stephen. I wanted to start with this. You often call Putin's regime empty but yet strong. As of June 27, 2023, today's day, is this still the case?
Yes. What we saw is that the aura, the mystique of the Putin regime was already severely damaged by the failures in Ukraine. He lost his aura, the magic of power, the sense that he was smarter, knew more skillful than anybody else. He lost this because of Ukrainian courage and ingenuity in resisting the Russian aggression. But he still holds the levers of power. He still sits in the Kremlin. He still controls the FSO. He still controls the National Guard. He still controls the key areas of the regime that protect his power. Also, he has a very important secret weapon, which is that people believe the fate of the Russian state and the fate of Putin could be connected. So that if Putin goes, Russia also as a state may collapse. This conflation of the personal regime and the fate of Russia is one of Putin's weapons that makes people afraid to act against him, even though the aura is gone. So hollow and hollowing out, and yet still strong.
Nevertheless, considering what took place, what do you think it means for Vladimir Putin? Will it change his way of governing?
He's in trouble. He staged a referendum on his regime unintentionally. Prigozhin's march, the so-called March for Justice, amounted to a referendum on Putin's regime. Authoritarian leaders benefit when people are afraid. They're afraid to act. They're intimidated to voice their opinions and go in public because the cost is so high. What we saw in China with Xi Jinping and zero COVID, and then COVID let it rip, following the repeal of zero COVID, was a referendum on Xi Jinping's rule in China, where everyone discovered what other people think about the regime, not just what they think. This is what happened with Prigozhin, this referendum. It was not something Putin intended, and maybe Prigozhin didn't intend this. But what was revealed was the apathy towards the regime. There was no rallying in defense of Putin's regime. There was no people in the streets claiming that they needed to defend Russia, to defend Putin's rule. And so you saw, for the most part, indifference, apathy. And this was very revealing and can no longer be hidden. It's something that Putin must manage going forward. How does he gain some of the mystique back? How does he gain some of the sense that he's a better ruler and that Russia is better off with him? It's not clear he'll be able to regain the mystique, but as I said, he still holds the levers of power.
I will come back to Vladimir Putin's future, but I think for this current moment, it's also important to consider whether Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion might have helped the Ukrainian armed forces. Do you think that this is the case?
Possibly. The best chance for a Ukrainian victory has always been disintegration of the Russian army on the battlefield with consequences back in Moscow, or disintegration of the political situation in Moscow with consequences on the battlefield. One way or the other, like dominoes. So far, the Russian battlefield in Ukraine has held, and so far the situation in Moscow has also held. So there have been no great breakthroughs for the war so far. It's very early. It's early to tell what's going to happen. It's very unpredictable. What we don't know is much greater than what we do know. And so we are watching very closely to see if the battlefield holds in Ukraine and if the Ukrainians are able to take advantage of the disarray in Moscow to try to destabilize, unravel the front in Russia.
Well, we'll talk about the state of the counteroffensive later in the program, but Steven, I wanted to ask you why Putin dropped the criminal charges against Prigozhin. At least for now, there are no charges against him for initiating an armed rebellion.
This is the most interesting part of what happened. Prigozhin spoke the truth about the war in Ukraine. Prigozhin is a liar. He lies all the time. But in this case, he voiced the truth, and the Russian people heard this truth. The truth that the war is a mistake, that the war is a criminal aggression, that the war was fought for the conquest of Ukraine in imperial terms, that the war was an outcome of the internal dynamics of the Putin regime. So it has nothing to do with the West. It has nothing to do with Russia being under threat from the outside. It has nothing to do with NATO expansion or any of the other lies that the Putin regime has told. So Prigozhin voiced the truth. Normally, someone who rises up against an authoritarian regime and voices the truth has to be wiped out for that regime to survive. It's very, very revealing that Putin either did not or could not act against Prigozhin. Putin has all the military assets on paper to have destroyed Prigozhin at any moment during this crisis. And yet he was not killed from the air. And then he was supposedly pardoned and allowed to go into exile. So this shows a lack of confidence on Putin's side that he could have acted decisively in this situation. He gave the excuse that he did not want to shed Russian blood. Well, that's what he's doing in Ukraine. He's sending Russian boys and girls into the meat grinder in Ukraine. He sent the Wagner forces into the meat grinder in Ukraine, and they've died in the tens of thousands and been wounded in the hundreds of thousands. So it wasn't about Putin not wanting to shed blood, because that's what he's doing all the time. It was instead, apparently, we're not sure, this is a surmise, about his lack of confidence that the military and the security forces would respond to put this down rather than stand aside.
Steven, in an interview with Foreign Affairs, you say that a dictatorship is strong as long as there are no alternatives. Is Prigozhin really an alternative to Putin? Maybe there is some kind of better option.
Yekaterina, we might find out. Anyone who appeals to Putin's base, a Russian nationalist, a Russian patriot, a tough guy, a strong leader, someone who's very effective at social media, anyone who appeals to that section of the Russian public is a threat to Putin, because that's Putin's base. Especially a threat if that person wears a uniform. And so Prigozhin demonstrated that that is the greatest vulnerability of the Putin regime. In an authoritarian regime, you have many different factions. The leader gives them overlapping jurisdictions. He pits them against each other. He makes them rivals and enemies in order to control them and in order that they would be beholden to him. He promotes people who are not clever, who are instead on the level of Shoigu, so that they do not present a threat if they have control, for example, over armed forces. This, of course, means that the regime is inefficient. The regime is ineffective. The regime is constantly at war with itself. The fact that this rose to the level of a march on Moscow shows the degradation, the increasing hollowness of the regime, but it also shows others in the regime that this is possible for them. It's possible for them to believe that they can do better, or that Russia needs a savior because Putin's regime is so degraded and because Russia is hurting. It's being self-damaged by what Putin is doing. Here's the problem, though, Yekaterina, the problem of collective action. Anybody who wants to move against Putin has to form a conspiracy with others. And as soon as you begin to talk to others about moving against Putin, those other people might fear, and they might run to Putin to tell him to snitch on you behind your back. Everyone is incentivized to protect themselves, and so everyone could potentially run to the leader, and it's very hard to mount a conspiracy. Collective action in an authoritarian regime is extremely difficult.
Thank you, Stephen. I hope you'll be able to join us again soon so I can ask you lots more questions. That was Stephen Kotkin, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. We spoke about the events of the past weekend in Russia and Prigozhin's effect on Vladimir Putin's authority in Russia.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times.
We had to leave, forced out of the country by new repressive laws after the first week of the war. Our freedom crushed by the authorities.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day.
There's no other independent news channel in Russian. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia in English as well.
So that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
We want to tell you firsthand what is really happening in Russia. Subscribe to TVRain Newsroom on YouTube, and let's take a look at our future together.